So, on to chapter 7 and gender identity and sexual orientation. This has been a really big growing subject area, not so much sexual orientation as the gender identity, trans athlete rights that we have seen over the last even just a couple years. I hardly addressed this topic a couple years ago in my class, and really over the last couple years, it has become a larger conversation because of the non-inclusiveness that we have seen pretty much from youth up into recreational level and elite level sports that we are realizing and experiencing with transgender athletes. So I think it's good to have a good vocabulary and the ability to talk about transgender people. It's okay to feel like you're a little lost in this topic or this subject, because it is we are developing a lot of new ways to communicate and have conversations around transgender, whether that's the people around us that move through everyday life or policies of inclusion in the educational realm, in the workplace, in general society, and in athletics. So it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to be unsure. I know I still make mistakes or don't quite clearly talk about trans people in the right way or the proper way, but we're all learning. And so I think that this is good for you to have an opportunity to understand and learn about transgender athletes. And it's good to first think about terminology. That's a good place to start so that you're using words correctly when talking about transgendered people overall. So a transgender person is a person whose gender identity and expression are not consistent with their physical sex assigned at birth. I think that, number one, is really important. Cisgender is one whose gender identity is consistent with sex assigned at birth. So I am a cisgender female. I was born female, identify as female, so I am a cis woman. Gender expression displays through your dress, movement, speech, behavior. So how you express yourself in terms of a more maleness or more femaleness is your gender expression, and then your identity is an internal sense of being female, male, both, neither male nor female, or transgender. I really like the first slide and the image that I included for you, the genderbread person. I think that's a really good way to understand the difference between sex and gender, right? Because a lot of times people say sex, when they really mean gender or the opposite. A perfect example of this is when many people ask me, are you going to find out the gender of your baby? Are you going to do a gender reveal? Those types of questions around having a child, and that's really not consistent with what they really are asking, which is, what is the sex of the baby, or the sex of your babies in my case, since I had twins. And so I never overly corrected people, but I did enough for them to know that it's not gender, but it's sex. So when people said, "Are you going to reveal the gender of your babies? Are you doing a gender reveal?" I would say, "Well, we know the sex of the babies, but we are not going to let people know what the sex of the babies are." And so I just sort of correcting people when my response, but not saying, "Oh, don't say gender, say sex," hopefully is one of the ways in which you can start to get people to understand that there is a difference between sex and gender, right? So I don't know the gender of my children. I think that their gender is female, their sex is female, but maybe their gender will be, maybe their gender identity will be something different. So I love that genderbread person because, your sex is what you're born with, right? This is like the parts, right? This is your chromosomal hormonal, physiological, and anatomical makeup, right? That's your sex. Your gender is a socially constructed idea. It's culturally constructed. There's expectations around gender, roles, behaviors associated with either masculinity or femininity. So that, is something really more about what you sense. Like what you feel like on the inside is your gender identity, and then your expression is what physically you see from the outside. So people look at me, I'm pretty sure that they would say that my gender expression is female. I also feel female on the inside, and I anatomically am female. And then, of course, I like too that it sort of talks about the genderbread person, that your identity does not equal expression, it doesn't equal sex. And gender doesn't equal sexual orientation. All of these things are sort of independent. So you can be a gender, you can have a gender expression that's one way, but your gender feels different, right? So I really like that genderbread person. I think it's helpful to understand how they are different. Because your attraction is one way doesn't mean your gender is going to be this, right? Or your attraction is this way doesn't mean your gender expression is going to be this. So anyway, I hope that you found that helpful too. I a couple years ago found that little like pictogram, and I really think it's effective. So hopefully you found it effective too. I do also have a list of vocabulary that I think is helpful, and I'm going to post that on Moodle because the vocabulary is something I think that's really helpful for, especially if you want to be a good ally. It gives you some common words that you would use with trans people. So just trans in general, what that term means, transition, transsexual versus transgender, what male to female transgender means, what female to male, gender nonconforming, cisgender, ally. All those terms are on that handout. And I know your book refers to those terms too, but I put them all in one handout. And then I also provide a top 5 points for allies to remember. If you want to be a good transgender ally, what are those 5 things? Respect, confidentiality, support, recognizing every journey is different, and to educate yourself. And then also some organizations that are ally groups that are doing work for trans athletes. Again, if you want to be a good ally yourself, or if you are a trans individual and you're looking for some organizations to help you, hopefully these identifying these can be that for you. So I'm going to post that in Moodle. It says Trans Athlete Handout, so you can take a look at that if you want. I always hand this out in class when I do this section. So people can have that. So anyway, when we want to talk about like policies around transgender athletes, the issues that we're seeing right now or having right now is the fact that there are not a lot of good, clear policies necessarily across the board from youth up to elite level and adult participation, like recreation leagues. We are seeing across the country that policies are starting to come to play in the K through 12 recreational category, but there are a lot of high school, like state high school leagues that are still working on developing policy. Lots of school districts really struggle when trans and gender nonconforming students wish to participate. There's just few existing policies right now for trans participation, but the recommendation from at the K through 12 level for inclusion is to allow transgender students or youth to be allowed to play in the sports in their affirmed gender, right? So not their biological sex, but their personal affirmed gender. And really, this kind of speaks to what we learned about biological factors, in that before puberty, there is very little difference in males and females. And so if a young girl identifies as male, she very well can fit right in and mix right in, and it won't be a huge concern or issue, or people are kind of wondering. And it's the opposite is true for male in a female environment. I think where we start to see the concerns about trans athletes is when we have, we start to see the difference in the hormones that have changed, and we see testosterone building muscle mass faster and more and at a faster rate and more frequently for males versus estrogen that impacts a woman's body differently. And so this is where we start to have the concerns around participation. So we have seen at the college level that the NCAA policy right now is, in which most schools sort of align their own sort of school policies with, is that a transgender student athlete should be allowed to participate in a sport and activity as long as that athlete's use of hormone therapy, if any, is consistent with that of the gender in which they're participating, right? So what that means is that with the NCAA, if a trans male, which is a female to male transition student athlete, has received treatment for testosterone, they may compete on a men's team, but they're no longer eligible to compete on a woman's team, right? And so if they have not been treated with testosterone, they may participate on a women's or a men's team, right? So so once they start testosterone treatment, they can compete with men's teams, but they're no longer eligible to compete on a women's team. If they have not been treated with testosterone, they can compete and participate in women's or men's. Now, a trans female, right, a male to female transition that is being treated with testosterone suppression medication may continue to compete on a men's team. So if they started the suppression hormone therapy, they could compete on a men's team, but they may not compete on a women's team until 1 calendar year of testosterone suppression has been taken. And the student athlete may participate or may practice with a women's team during that year of ineligibility if they choose to. Now, if they are not being treated with testosterone suppression, they may compete on a men's team, but they may not on a women's team. Okay, so that's the NCAA policy. That's what most schools have adopted, and that's what a lot of like schools, whether high school leagues, or conferences, or just individual schools in general, have tended to adopt those same parameters, both for female to male transition and male to female transition. There are waiver guidelines, right? So, the NCAA does provide waiver guidelines for student athletes transitioning from male to female. And this has to do with like losing seasons of competition, and they have to provide medical documentation. There's a lot of red tape. This is troubling for some people. Like, this is troubling for a lot of like ally groups and advocates for transgender athlete participation, because you have to go through a lot more steps just to be able to participate with your affirmed gender category or team, and that can be very frustrating, sometimes humiliating. So it doesn't feel ultimately ultra inclusive. However, of course, the folks that really struggle with the level of fairness want there to be some parameters that seem to identify that this is how they're able to capture that level of fairness, is by making sure that testosterone levels aren't way out of sort of normal range for females, those competing as females, so as to not gain an extra advantage, right? So there's definitely some policy considerations that have taken effect. There are lots of instances where policies have not been put into play yet. So we're still working on this. This is still an area of growth in a lot of cases, from K through 12 to college, and even at the elite levels. And I really have found it great and interesting, and I'm really glad that we've had some good media review articles by this summer on transgender athletes and competition, and that you have all participated in having a conversation or adding to the discussion. around what seems fair and right and just by those athletes that are transgender, or even ones that aren't transgender, but maybe are dealing with intersex issues or what have you. So I appreciate that, because I think that that has been a perfectly aligned conversation with this, topic. Um, so I did on your book talks about transitioning athletes, female to male, what they deal with, what they sort of go through. I included the story on your PowerPoint, the story of Schuler Baylor. This is one of the more popular female to male transitioned athletes at the college level, a swimmer for Harvard. So I hope you click on that to read a little bit about his story. And then one of the more popular, outside of Caitlyn Jenner, one of the more popular male to female transgender athletes, pro athletes out there is Mayan Begar, who was a Denmark-born but Australian citizen pro golfer. And she took suppression therapy, testosterone therapy, increased her estrogen, and so what happens when he transitioned, and any male to female athlete transitions, what happens to their body. And so both of those slides provide you with the different things that happen to their bodies physically from the transition with the hormone change in their body. So we definitely have a couple of really good stories along with that. Mayan Bager, she is a very vocal athlete, vocal proponent, or someone, sort of a identity person that has identified themselves as a pro, obviously an advocate for helping transgender athletes. One of my favorites, actually, in all honesty. Caitlyn Jenner. Really interesting story too, of course. Won the ESPY award a couple years back, the sort of Arthur Ashe Courage Award. And I think Caitlyn Jenner really brought to light, she really brought a large narrative around the inclusion of transgender athletes. And so I'm very thankful for her for that. I do think Mayan Begar has done a lot more on the ground, because she's still actively competing as an athlete, whereas Caitlyn Jenner was a decathlete gold medalist, amazing as a male, and obviously the greatest male athlete on earth, which is what the decathlete is always coined as. But that was a past history in athletics, and she never really had a chance to share her experiences as an athlete going through the transition. So her story is just a little bit different in that she's very widely known. Obviously, her relationship with the Kardashian family as well. But the reason I like Mayan Begar is because she is living a life as a transgender athlete, has dealt with a lot of discrimination on the LPGA tour. And so that's why I like her story, for looking at athletes that are dealing with living as a transgender, competing as an athlete. And then, of course, sexual orientation. This is an area we've seen a lot of growth for gay and lesbian athletes. Sexual orientation is one's emotional and sexual attractions. Your identity, your sexual identity, is a person's sense of self-based is a person's sense of self-based on sexual orientation, as well as a connection to a community of others who share that particular orientation. So what we do still see, and what we have seen, is a homonegativism, which is negative treatment or discrimination and bigotry toward lesbian and bisexual people. We really do still live in very much a heteronormative culture when we talk about sports. A lot of it has to do with the sort of the top down effect in terms of who's making the decisions, who sort of runs, who runs the sports world, and we're still looking at cisgender white males, right? This is who really makes all the biggest decisions at the top, and so with that comes a real heteronormative context and a real heteronormative narrative, and so because this is the case, we still do see a lot of homonegativism, and it's very heteronormative. I always tell when I give talks or when I work with young people and we talk about the state of athletics, I always put it in a heteronormative context. I say that and I tell people how that's wrong. It's not okay because it's very not inclusive, right? It has a large level of non-inclusivity that we still need to really work hard to break barriers down for. And of course, trans negativism comes with that as well. And trans negativism and homonegativism really creates these environments that are very, very hostile for these athletes. And so a lot of times there's big consequences for homonegativism and transnegativism that we see for athletes: depression, stress, anxiety, obviously a decreased level of self-confidence and self-esteem, abuse and sort of self-infliction of harm. And so we want to make sure that we are creating inclusive environments because when we have prejudice in sport performance, we typically will see athletes having some of those negative responses like low motivation, burnout. They get distracted. That creates stress that interferes with their performance. And of course, it can create divisiveness on a team. You can have cliques formed. And so it's very important that we think about how do we create inclusive environments. When we see inclusive environments, not only from like a top level down, but within certain programs, within athletic environments. So not only from like an athletic department as a whole, say like at Wittenberg, but also within each team, we recognize and know that that athletes are very supported, right? And we know that it creates good inclusive environments. And those characteristics are coaches being very supportive of LGBTQ athletes. They're maybe open, their teammates are open to recognize that they are of the LGBT community. And you see at least one ally in the athletic administration. So there's somebody who's sort of a beacon of hope for those student athletes, that they know that's someone that they could go to if they're having issues with any kind of discrimination or negative experiences. They know that there's somebody in that administration that's going to help them with any kind of concerns that they have. Because the benefits of inclusive climate is that it removes, one of the big ones to me is that it removes pressures of secrecy. When you feel open to be yourself, you don't have to hide who you are. You can be fully engaged in what you're doing and not worry about any kind of negative consequences. It allows coaches and athletes to be able to focus. Teammates can learn from their experiences because it's somebody different. The biases and the stereotypes are challenged and changed. And what you start to see is that teammates that become allies, and those allies go out into the world and they're allies to other people, right? And we would hope that then intersectionality helps to give straight people, cisgender people, the ability to include and stand up for those in the LGBTQ plus community in the future. And so they become allies, they become strong advocates. They themselves will turn and challenge discrimination when they see it happening around them, even though it doesn't directly impact them. And we love it when diverse identities become normalized, because that makes for a more rich environment no matter where we are in the world. So there is an ally movement that has been happening over the last decade or so for LGBTQ plus student athletes. It aims to create social change and social justice in sport. A couple of these ally movements are the Athlete Ally and the You Can Play Project. They fight discrimination based on sexual and gender identity. They aim to make sports safe for LGBTQ plus athletes. And so if you're interested at all in, knowing more about how to be an ally, how to provide opportunity or support for LGBTQ plus athletes, those are two great places to start: Athlete Ally and the You Can Play project. And those are ways you can find out more about resources for athletes in this category, how to you yourself be a better spokesperson or proponent for this community, and certainly if you're involved with athletes of this in this population, it will help you do a better job to, again, create an inclusive environment, because we want people to thrive in the environments that they participate in. And so what we can do to help people do that is create an inclusive environment. So a couple questions for your next inquiry forum. I do want to know, did you come from a high school that had a trans athlete participation policy that you're aware of? You may not even know. You may not have any trans friends that you're aware of, because no one has to disclose that to you, of course, right, if they are trans. So I'm really curious, though, if you know, or if you are aware if there was a trans policy, trans athlete policy at your school. If there was, if you noticed anything with that, if students talked about it. Then also I'm wondering if you have, did you have any friends that were LGBTQ plus growing up, or even now, that participate in athletics? Do they experience any homonegativity? Do they have concerns about homonegativity? Is the environment that they either participate in now or did participate in, was it homonegative or inclusive? Do they recognize that made a difference for them either direction, right? So if they're LGBTQ and they were in a homonegative environment, but they loved their sport, did it make a difference, or did they just compete, right? If they're LGBTQ and they were in a very inclusive environment, did that make a difference in how they competed and how they, trained? And then the last question I have for you is, how would you make an inclusive environment, and how would you go about developing an inclusive environment and safe environment in an athletic team for LGBTQ plus people? And this can be from any angle, right? So as a coach, as a teammate, as a fan, maybe as a family member or parent, how would you, or as an administrator, right? How, from any angle, maybe you're I don't know, I'm not going to work in sports, I have no idea. Maybe you don't know how you would make that possible. Hi, Maisie. This is my daughter, Maisie. But if you could help establish a way to make an inclusive environment, how would you do that? What are some of the things that you would do? So those are 3 questions for you that you can answer in your next inquiry forum. There's going to be some more in the next video, so make sure that you catch all of them and respond to all of them for your next inquiry forum. And my daughter Maisie just woke up from her nap, so you can say hi to her. Can you say hi, Maisie? Can you say hi? Say hi to the camera, honey. Say hi to my class. Just woke up from her nap. Anyway, thank you for joining us, Maisie. And and I hope that was a good little chuckle for you. I'll see you guys in the next and last lecture for this week. Thank you.